How medieval homes looked in England 1,000 years ago. Just stop and think about that for a moment. 1,000 years, a millennium. That is roughly 40 generations of human beings who lived, loved, suffered, and died in homes that most of us today could barely imagine surviving a single night in. And yet those homes, those rough, smoke-filled, wind-battered structures, were the cradles of an entire civilization. They were the places where English culture was forged, where language evolved, where communities formed bonds that would echo through the centuries. How medieval homes looked in England 1,000 years ago is not just a question about architecture. It is a question about what it meant to be human in one of the most challenging periods of history. Picture this. It is the year 1020. England is a land still recovering from decades of Viking invasions, political upheaval, and the slow, grinding process of unification under a single crown. King Canute sits on the English throne, a Danish conqueror who has somehow managed to win the loyalty of a battered Anglo-Saxon people. The great cathedrals that would later define the English landscape have not yet been built. The Norman conquest, which will reshape the country forever, is still nearly half a century away. London is a modest town by modern standards, a cluster of timber buildings hugging the northern bank of the Thames, surrounded by Roman walls that are already crumbling with age. And beyond London, across the rolling green hills and dense forests of England, millions of people are waking up each morning in homes that would leave a modern observer speechless. Not speechless with admiration, necessarily. Speechless with a mixture of fascination, horror, and a strange, grudging respect. Because those homes, for all their discomfort and danger, represented the very best that ordinary people could achieve with the materials, knowledge, and resources available to them. And understanding how those homes were built, how they functioned, and how they shaped the daily lives of their inhabitants is one of the most revealing windows we have into the medieval world. Let us begin where any good story must begin, at the ground level, literally. Because the floor of a medieval home in England around the year 1020 was, in most cases, nothing more than packed earth. Compacted dirt, trampled down over months and years by the feet of the household, until it formed a hard, uneven surface that was perpetually cold, perpetually damp, and perpetually filthy by modern standards. Wealthy households might scatter rushes or straw across the earthen floor, a practice that served multiple purposes. The rushes provided a thin layer of insulation against the cold ground. They absorbed spills and food scraps, and they could be replaced periodically, offering a rudimentary form of cleanliness. But make no mistake, even in the most prosperous homes, the floor was a far cry from anything a modern person would consider hygienic. For the vast majority of the English population in 1020, home was a structure known as a longhouse. The name tells you almost everything you need to know about its shape. It was long, narrow, and rectangular, with a single large room that served as kitchen, dining hall, bedroom, workshop, and sometimes even barn, all at once. The typical longhouse was constructed primarily of timber, oak when it was available, or whatever other wood could be sourced from the local forests. The walls were formed using a technique called wattle and daub. First, a framework of sturdy vertical timbers was set into the ground. Then, thin branches or strips of wood, the wattle, were woven horizontally between the uprights, creating a lattice. Finally, a thick paste of mud, clay, animal dung, and straw, the daub, was smeared over the wattle, filling in the gaps and creating a solid wall once it dried. It was simple, it was effective, and it was surprisingly durable. Some wattle and daub walls survived for decades before needing significant repair. The roof was another matter entirely. In most parts of England, roofing material meant one thing: thatch. Thick bundles of dried reeds, straw, or heather were layered over a timber frame, creating a roof that was remarkably good at shedding rain when properly maintained. A well-thatched roof could last 20 years or more before it needed to be replaced. But thatch had one devastating weakness, and every medieval English household lived in constant awareness of it: fire. A stray spark from the central hearth, a candle knocked over in the night, a lightning strike during a summer storm. Any of these could turn a thatched roof into a blazing inferno in minutes. And once the fire started, there was almost nothing that could be done to save the building. The occupants would grab whatever they could carry and flee into the night, watching their entire lives go up in flames. House fires were so common in medieval England that many communities developed informal systems for helping burned-out families rebuild. It was not a matter of if your home would catch fire, but when. And yet, despite this constant danger, the people of medieval England did not abandon thatch. They could not afford to. Stone tiles and lead roofing were luxuries reserved for churches, monasteries, and the homes of the wealthiest lords. For ordinary people, thatch was the only option that was both affordable and available in sufficient quantities. So they lived with the risk, kept water buckets near the hearth, and prayed. The central hearth was, without exaggeration, the heart of the medieval home. It was typically nothing more than a flat stone or a shallow pit in the middle of the main room, upon which a fire was kept burning for as much of the day as fuel would allow. There was no chimney. That innovation would not become common in English homes for several more centuries. Instead, the smoke from the fire simply rose upward, filling the upper reaches of the room before eventually finding its way out through gaps in the thatch, through small openings in the gable ends, or through a purpose-built hole in the roof called a louver. The result was an interior atmosphere that a modern person would find almost unbearable. The air inside a medieval longhouse was thick with smoke, permanently hazy, and carrying the acrid smell of burning wood mixed with cooking food, damp earth, and the ever-present odor of the animals that often shared the same space. Because that is one detail that consistently shocks modern observers when they learn about medieval domestic life. In many households, particularly those of farmers, which is to say the vast majority of the population, livestock lived inside the same building as the human occupants. The longhouse was often divided roughly in half, with the family occupying one end and their cattle, sheep, or pigs housed at the other. A low partition, sometimes nothing more than a wattle screen, separated the two areas. The arrangement had a practical logic that outweighed any considerations of comfort or hygiene. The animals needed protection from predators and harsh weather. Keeping them inside the home meant they were always accessible for milking, feeding, and monitoring. And, perhaps most importantly, in the depths of an English winter, the body heat generated by several large animals provided a significant source of warmth for the entire building. A longhouse with half a dozen cattle at one end could be noticeably warmer than one without. In a world without central heating, without insulation, without even glass windows, that warmth could mean the difference between a merely uncomfortable winter and a genuinely dangerous one. Speaking of windows, or rather, the lack of them, the windows in a medieval English home around the year 1020 were nothing like what we think of today. Glass was extraordinarily expensive and was used almost exclusively in churches and the grandest secular buildings. For ordinary homes, a window was simply a small opening in the wall. The word itself comes from the Old Norse vindauga, meaning wind eye. These openings were kept small to minimize heat loss, and they were often covered with oiled linen or parchment, which allowed some light to filter through while providing a meager barrier against wind and rain. Wooden shutters could be closed over the openings at night or during storms, plunging the interior into near-total darkness. The result was that medieval homes were, by modern standards, extraordinarily dark. Even on a bright summer day, the interior of a longhouse would have been dim and shadowy, lit primarily by the glow of the hearth fire and perhaps a few tallow candles or rush lights, cheap, smoky sources of illumination made from animal fat. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal, porque aqui você não apenas aprende história, você viaja no tempo e vive experiências que os livros de escola nunca vão te mostrar. Se inscreva agora e ative o sininho para não perder nenhuma viagem dessas. Chapter 2: The Lords, the Halls, and the Great Divide. If the lives of ordinary English people in the year 1020 were defined by the rough simplicity of the longhouse, the lives of the nobility were defined by something altogether different: the Great Hall. And the contrast between the two is one of the most striking illustrations of the vast inequality that characterized medieval English society. The Great Hall was the centerpiece of any lord's estate. It was in many ways the direct ancestor of the modern living room, dining room, and community center, all rolled into one. But where the peasant's longhouse was a cramped, dark, smoke-filled rectangle, the Great Hall was designed to impress. It was a statement of power, wealth, and social standing, and every element of its construction was intended to communicate the Lord's importance to anyone who entered. A typical great hall of this period was a large rectangular building, significantly bigger than anything else in the surrounding settlement. The walls were usually constructed of timber, though in some cases, particularly after the Norman conquest of 1066, stone began to be used. The roof was the hall's crowning glory, an ambitious structure of heavy oak beams that soared high above the floor, creating a cavernous interior space that dwarfed anything the local peasants would have experienced. The craftsmanship required to construct such a roof was considerable, and the carpenters who could build them were highly skilled and highly valued. The layout of the Great Hall followed a pattern that remained remarkably consistent across England for centuries. At one end of the hall was a raised platform called the dais, upon which the Lord and his family sat during meals and ceremonies. The dais was typically elevated by a foot or more above the main floor, ensuring that the Lord was literally looking down upon his guests and retainers. Behind the dais, a doorway led to the Lord's private chambers, the solar as it came to be called, which provided a degree of privacy and comfort that was unavailable to anyone else in the household. The rest of the hall was a single large open space, dominated by a central hearth similar to, though far larger than, the one found in a peasant's longhouse. Long wooden tables and benches were arranged on either side of the hearth, and it was here that the Lord's retainers, servants, and guests ate their meals, conducted business, and, at the end of the day, unrolled their sleeping mats and bedded down for the night. Because for most members of a lord's household, the Great Hall was not just a place for eating and socializing, it was also where they slept. Privacy, as we understand it today, was an almost non-existent concept in medieval England. People ate together, worked together, and slept together, separated at most by thin curtains or wooden screens. The food prepared and consumed in these halls deserves particular attention because it tells us a great deal about the social dynamics of medieval England. The Lord and his family, seated on the raised dais, ate significantly better than the rest of the household. Their meals might include roasted meats, beef, pork, mutton, venison, served with bread made from fine wheat flour, accompanied by imported wine or good quality ale. The retainers and servants, seated at the lower tables, ate more modestly. Their bread was likely made from coarser grains, barley, rye, or a mixture called maslin. Their meat, if they received any at all, was more likely to be salted or preserved rather than fresh. And their drink was usually ale of varying quality, brewed on site by the household's own brewers. But even the humblest meal served in a lord's great hall was a feast compared to what ordinary peasants ate in their longhouses. The diet of the average English peasant in 1020 was monotonous and nutritionally marginal. It was dominated by bread, heavy, dark, coarse bread made from barley or rye, supplemented by pottage, a thick stew of whatever vegetables, legumes, and scraps of meat could be scraped together. Cabbage, onions, leeks, beans, and peas were common ingredients. Meat was a luxury that most peasants enjoyed only on special occasions, feast days, celebrations, or after a successful hunt. Dairy products, milk, cheese, butter, were more accessible, particularly for families that kept their own cattle or goats. But even these were subject to the unpredictable rhythms of the agricultural year. A bad harvest, a cattle disease, a prolonged drought, any of these could push a peasant family from subsistence to starvation with terrifying speed. The furniture inside a medieval home, whether a lord's hall or a peasant's longhouse, was sparse by modern standards. The most important piece of furniture in any household was the bed. For a lord, this might be an elaborate affair, a wooden frame with a straw or feather mattress, covered with linen sheets and woolen blankets, and enclosed by heavy curtains that provided both warmth and a precious measure of privacy. For a peasant, the bed was far simpler. A straw-filled pallet laid directly on the earthen floor, perhaps with a rough woolen blanket for warmth. Many peasant families shared a single sleeping space, huddling together for warmth during the cold English winters. Beyond the bed, the typical medieval home contained surprisingly little furniture. A table, often nothing more than a board laid across trestles, was used for meals. A few stools or benches provided seating. A wooden chest, if the family was fortunate enough to own one, served as storage for clothing, tools, and other valuables. And that for most households was the extent of it. The cluttered, furniture-filled rooms that we take for granted today would have been unimaginable to a medieval English peasant. One aspect of medieval domestic life that often goes unmentioned in popular accounts is the role of women in maintaining the household. In a society where the home was the primary unit of economic production, women bore an enormous burden of daily labor. They were responsible for cooking, cleaning, mending clothes, tending the garden, brewing ale, making cheese and butter, spinning wool, and caring for the household's smaller animals, chickens, geese, and pigs. Many of these tasks were performed inside the home, in the dim, smoky interior of the longhouse, surrounded by the constant noise and activity of the household. The work was physically demanding, repetitive, and unending. It began before dawn and continued until after dark, day after day, season after season, year after year. The brewing of ale, in particular, was a critically important household task that was almost exclusively the province of women, so much so that female brewers were known as alewives. Ale was not merely a recreational beverage in medieval England. It was a dietary staple, consumed by virtually everyone, every day, in significant quantities. There were practical reasons for this. The water supply in medieval England was frequently contaminated and unsafe to drink. The brewing process, which involved boiling water and fermenting grain, killed many of the pathogens that made raw water dangerous. Ale was, in a very real sense, the safest thing to drink. And so every household that could manage it brewed its own ale, and the alewife who produced it held a position of quiet but genuine importance within the community. The construction methods used in medieval English homes also tell us something profound about the relationship between people and their environment. Medieval builders did not fight against the landscape, they worked with it. Homes were sited to take advantage of natural features, south-facing slopes for maximum sunlight, sheltered valleys for protection from the wind, proximity to water sources for drinking and washing. Building materials were sourced locally, because the cost and difficulty of transporting heavy materials over long distances made imported materials prohibitively expensive for all but the wealthiest builders. In areas where good timber was abundant, the heavily forested regions of the Midlands and the North, homes were built almost entirely of wood. In areas where timber was scarce but stone was plentiful, parts of the West Country, the Cotswolds, and the North, stone construction was more common, even for relatively modest dwellings. And in the low-lying marshlands of East Anglia, where neither timber nor stone was readily available, builders turned to whatever materials the landscape provided: mud, clay, reeds, and turf. This intimate connection between landscape and architecture gave medieval England a remarkable architectural diversity that can still be seen today. The honey-colored limestone cottages of the Cotswolds, the flint-walled houses of Norfolk, the half-timbered buildings of Herefordshire and Shropshire. All of these regional styles have their roots in the medieval period, when builders had no choice but to use what the local landscape offered them. But perhaps the most revealing feature of medieval English domestic architecture is what it tells us about the concept of community. Medieval homes were not designed for individual privacy or personal space. They were designed for communal living. The open plan of the longhouse, the shared sleeping arrangements of the Great Hall, the lack of internal walls or separate rooms, all of these features reflect a society in which the individual was always embedded within a larger group. The family, the household, the village, the manor, these were the units that mattered. The idea that a person might want or need a space of their own, separate from the rest of the household, was simply not part of the medieval worldview. This communal orientation had profound implications for daily life. Conflicts could not be avoided by retreating to a separate room. Disagreements had to be resolved face to face in the presence of the entire household. Intimacy was conducted within earshot, and often within sight, of others. Illness was a communal experience, with the sick cared for in the middle of the household's daily activity. Birth and death occurred in the same room where meals were eaten and work was done. There was no separation between the sacred and the mundane, between the public and the private. Life in a medieval English home was, in every sense, a shared experience. Agora, antes de continuarmos essa jornada fascinante pela Inglaterra medieval, me conta aqui nos comentários: Se você pudesse voltar no tempo e passar uma semana vivendo em uma casa medieval, você teria coragem? Escreve aí. Eu teria coragem. Ou nem pensar. Quero saber a opinião de cada um de vocês. Chapter 3. The Transformation. From Saxon Simplicity to Norman Ambition. The year 1566 changed everything. When William, Duke of Normandy, defeated King Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings and claimed the English crown, he set in motion a transformation that would reshape not only the political landscape of England, but also the very physical landscape, including the homes in which people lived. The Norman conquest brought with it a fundamentally different approach to building. The Normans were, above all, builders. They built to conquer, to control, and to impress. Within 2 decades of their arrival, they had constructed hundreds of castles across England, from simple motte and bailey fortifications of earth and timber, to massive stone keeps like the White Tower in London, which still stands today as one of the most imposing medieval structures in Europe. But the Normans did not only build castles, they also built churches, monasteries, manor houses, and, eventually, towns. And in doing so, they introduced architectural techniques and aesthetic sensibilities that gradually filtered down through English society, changing the way ordinary people thought about their homes. The most significant change was the increasing use of stone. Before the conquest, stone construction in England was almost exclusively reserved for churches and the most important secular buildings. The Anglo-Saxons, as we have seen, had a deep cultural preference for timber building, a preference rooted not in ignorance of stone construction, but in a conscious choice that reflected their cultural identity. The Normans had no such attachment to timber. They came from a tradition of stone building, and they brought that tradition with them to England. Within a generation, stone manor houses were appearing across the English countryside, replacing or supplementing the older timber halls. These early Norman manor houses were not yet the grand country estates that would emerge in later centuries. They were relatively modest structures by aristocratic standards, rectangular stone buildings with thick walls, narrow windows, and a single large hall on the ground floor or the first floor. The ground floor, if the hall was elevated, was typically used for storage. The hall itself was reached by an external staircase, a defensive feature that could be easily removed or destroyed in the event of an attack. Inside, the layout was similar to the older Anglo-Saxon great halls, with a central hearth, a raised dais for the lord, and an open plan that accommodated the entire household. But stone brought advantages that timber could not match. Stone walls were fireproof, or at least far more fire-resistant than timber and wattle. They were more durable, requiring less frequent repair and maintenance. They provided better insulation against the cold and damp of the English climate, and they were stronger, capable of supporting larger and more ambitious roof structures. Over time, as stone construction techniques improved and became more widely understood, stone began to be used not only for the walls, but also for the foundations, the window surrounds, and eventually the floors of manor houses. The earthen floors of the Anglo-Saxon period were gradually replaced, in wealthier homes at least, by flagstone or tile floors that were easier to clean and more comfortable to walk on. The introduction of the chimney was another transformative development, though it occurred more gradually than popular imagination might suggest. The earliest chimneys in English domestic buildings appeared in the 12th century, and they did not become common in ordinary homes for several centuries after that. But for the homes that did adopt them, the change was revolutionary. A chimney allowed the smoke from the hearth to be channeled directly out of the building, rather than filling the entire interior before slowly seeping through the roof. This single innovation transformed the interior atmosphere of the home. Rooms became cleaner, brighter, and far more comfortable. It became possible to have an upper floor, a loft or solar, above the main hall, because the smoke was no longer rising freely to the roof. And the chimney made it possible to move the fireplace from the center of the room to a wall, opening up the interior space and allowing for new arrangements of furniture and activity. The gradual development of the solar, the Lord's private chamber, was perhaps the most socially significant architectural change of the post-conquest period. In the Anglo-Saxon Great Hall, the Lord and his family had enjoyed little privacy. They sat on the dais in full view of the entire household, and their sleeping quarters were separated from the rest of the hall by nothing more than a curtain or screen. The solar changed this fundamentally. It was a separate room, usually located at one end of the hall, above the service rooms, to which the lord and his family could withdraw from the noise and bustle of the communal hall. It was heated by its own fireplace, lit by larger windows than those in the main hall, and furnished with greater comfort. The solar was, in effect, the first private room in English domestic architecture, and its emergence marks a crucial shift in medieval social attitudes, the beginning of a long, slow movement toward the idea that individuals and families were entitled to a space of their own, separate from the rest of the household. This shift did not happen overnight, and it did not affect all levels of society equally. For the peasant farmer living in a wattle and daub longhouse in rural Yorkshire, the concept of a private room remained as alien and unattainable in 1200 as it had been in 1000. The longhouse continued to be the standard form of peasant housing throughout the medieval period, though it did undergo gradual improvements over time. The wattle and daub became better quality. The thatch became thicker and more carefully laid. Some longhouses acquired a second room, a modest addition that separated the living space from the byre where the animals were kept. A few of the more prosperous peasant households even managed to acquire stone foundations or partial stone walls, raising their homes above the worst of the damp and providing a more durable structure. But these improvements were incremental and uneven. The fundamental character of peasant housing, its darkness, its smoke, its lack of privacy, its intimate coexistence with livestock, remained largely unchanged throughout the medieval period. The great architectural revolution that the Normans brought to England was primarily a revolution for the elite. The castles, the stone manor houses, the churches with their soaring Gothic arches and brilliant stained glass. These were the buildings that captured the imagination and demonstrated the ambition of the new ruling class. The homes of ordinary people remained humble, practical, and largely invisible to history. And yet, those humble homes were the places where the real life of medieval England was lived. They were the places where women rose before dawn to rekindle the fire and begin the day's work, where men ate their bread and pottage before heading out to the fields, where neighbors gathered on winter evenings to share stories and ale, where the sick were nursed and the dying were mourned, where the rhythms of the agricultural year, plowing, sowing, harvesting, threshing, were reflected in the rhythms of domestic life, where the great events of the wider world, wars, plagues, political upheavals, were experienced not as abstract historical forces, but as immediate personal realities that could destroy a family's livelihood in an instant. The Black Death of 1348 and 1349 is perhaps the most dramatic example of how events in the wider world could transform domestic life in medieval England. The plague killed an estimated 1/3 to 1/2 of the English population in less than 2 years. The demographic catastrophe had enormous consequences for housing. Thousands of homes were simply abandoned as their occupants died or fled. Entire villages were depopulated. The ghostly remains of these lost villages can still be detected in the English landscape today, visible as patterns of humps and hollows in otherwise empty fields. But the Black Death also had unexpected positive consequences for the survivors. With the population dramatically reduced, labor became scarce and therefore more valuable. Peasant workers found themselves in a position to demand higher wages and better conditions. Many were able to move to more productive land, abandoning their old homes and building new, better ones. The quality of peasant housing improved significantly in the decades following the plague. Homes became larger. Construction became more substantial. The longhouse, with its shared space for humans and animals, gradually gave way to separate buildings for living and farming. Stone foundations became more common. Some prosperous peasant families even began to build homes with 2 stories, a dramatic departure from the single-story longhouse that had been the norm for centuries. This post-plague improvement in housing standards is one of the great untold stories of medieval English history. It is a reminder that even in the midst of catastrophe, human beings have a remarkable capacity for adaptation and improvement. The survivors of the Black Death did not simply endure. They built. They built better homes, better communities, and better lives for themselves and their descendants. And in doing so, they laid the foundations for the architectural traditions that would define the English countryside for centuries to come. The medieval period also saw the emergence of something we might recognize as urban housing. As towns grew in size and importance during the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries, a distinctive form of townhouse evolved to meet the needs of merchants, craftsmen, and other urban dwellers. The typical medieval townhouse was built on a narrow plot of land. Land in towns was expensive, and owners sought to maximize their use of limited frontage on the street. The result was a building that was narrow at the front, but extended deep into the interior of the plot. The ground floor was typically used as a shop or workshop, open to the street, where the owner conducted business during the day. The upper floors, reached by an internal staircase or an external ladder, served as living quarters. Behind the main building, a yard or garden provided space for storage, animal keeping, and waste disposal. These townhouses were built primarily of timber, using a technique known as timber framing. A skeleton of heavy oak beams was erected first, and the spaces between the beams were filled with wattle and daub, brick, or plaster. The upper stories often projected out over the street, a feature known as jettying, which increased the floor space on the upper levels. This practice was so common that in some medieval streets, the upper stories of the buildings on opposite sides nearly touched, creating a dark, enclosed canyon below. Town authorities periodically attempted to ban jettying on the grounds that it blocked light and air and increased the risk of fire spreading between buildings, but the practice persisted because the additional floor space was too valuable to give up. Fire was, if anything, an even greater danger in medieval towns than in the countryside. The close-packed timber buildings, separated by narrow streets and alleys, were extraordinarily vulnerable to fire. A single blaze could consume entire neighborhoods in a matter of hours. Medieval towns experienced devastating fires with depressing regularity. London alone suffered major conflagrations in 1087, 1135, 1212, and numerous other occasions, each time rebuilding in much the same materials and much the same way, because timber was still the most affordable and accessible building material. Se você está achando essa viagem no tempo tão fascinante quanto eu, deixa aquele like poderoso no vídeo e compartilha com aquele amigo que ama a história. Esse simples gesto ajuda demais a levar esse conteúdo para mais pessoas apaixonadas por história. Chapter 4: Echoes in Stone. What medieval homes teach us about ourselves? As the medieval period drew toward its close, the 15th century giving way to the 16th, the medieval world gradually yielding to the Renaissance, the homes of England stood as monuments to everything the people of that era had endured, achieved, and dreamed of. And standing among those homes today, whether in the preserved medieval streets of York and Lavenham, the ruined manors scattered across the countryside, or the archaeological sites where the outlines of long-vanished longhouses can still be traced in the soil, one cannot help but feel a profound connection to the people who built and inhabited them. That connection is not merely sentimental. It is architectural. It is cultural. It is, in a very real sense, genetic. The building traditions that evolved in medieval England did not vanish when the medieval period ended. They adapted, evolved, and persisted. The timber-framed houses of the Tudor period are direct descendants of the medieval townhouse. The stone cottages of the Cotswolds and the Lake District trace their lineage back to the stone-built homes that began to replace timber construction after the Norman conquest. Even the basic layout of the English home, the separation of public and private spaces, the central importance of the fireplace, the kitchen as a distinct room, can be traced back to innovations that first appeared in medieval domestic architecture. Consider the fireplace. Today, it is primarily a decorative feature, a symbol of warmth and domesticity, rather than a functional necessity. But for the people of medieval England, the fireplace was the single most important element of their home. It provided warmth in a climate that could be brutally cold. It provided light in homes that were perpetually dark. It provided the means to cook food, brew ale, heat water, and dry clothes. And its position within the home, central in the early period, moved to the wall after the introduction of the chimney, determined the entire spatial organization of the building. The evolution of the fireplace from a simple open hearth in the middle of the floor to a contained wall-mounted fixture with a proper chimney is, in miniature, the story of medieval English domestic architecture itself. It is a story of gradual improvement, ingenious adaptation, and the slow but relentless pursuit of greater comfort and safety. Or consider the concept of the room. Today, we take it for granted that a home consists of multiple separate rooms, each with its own function: bedroom, kitchen, living room, bathroom. But for most of the medieval period, the idea of a separate room was a luxury available only to the very wealthy. The great majority of people lived in a single open space where all the activities of daily life, cooking, eating, working, sleeping, took place simultaneously. The emergence of the multi-room house was a revolution in domestic architecture, and it happened gradually over centuries, driven by a growing desire for privacy, specialization, and comfort. The solar of the Norman Manor house was the first step. The separation of the kitchen from the main hall was the second. The addition of private bedrooms, initially for the lord's family, later for other members of the household, was the third. And so, room by room, the medieval home evolved into something recognizably similar to the homes we live in today. The medieval home also teaches us something important about the relationship between wealth and architecture. In medieval England, your home was one of the most visible indicators of your social status. The size of your hall, the quality of your building materials, the height of your roof, the number of your windows, all of these communicated to the world exactly where you stood in the social hierarchy. A Lord's stone manor house, with its great hall, its solar, its chapel, and its surrounding outbuildings, was an unmistakable statement of power and prestige. A peasant's wattle and daub longhouse, with its earthen floor and its shared space with livestock, was an equally unmistakable marker of humble status. The architecture of the home was a language that everyone in medieval society understood, and it spoke volumes about the person who lived within. This is not entirely different from our own time, of course. We still judge people, consciously or unconsciously, by the homes they live in. The size, location, style, and condition of a person's home still communicate information about their wealth, taste, and social standing. But in medieval England, the connection between home and status was even more direct and inescapable. There were no suburbs where a middle-class family could aspire to live in a house that mimicked the style of the aristocracy. There was no mass-produced furniture that could give a modest home the appearance of greater wealth. What you had was what you could build with your own hands or pay someone to build for you, using materials sourced from the land around you. Your home was an honest reflection of your circumstances, for better or for worse. Perhaps the most profound lesson that medieval homes teach us is about resilience. The people of medieval England lived in conditions that most of us today would find intolerable. Their homes were cold, dark, smoky, and cramped. They had no running water, no sanitation, no heating beyond the open fire, no lighting beyond candles and rushlights. They shared their living space with animals. They were constantly vulnerable to fire, to flood, to the collapse of a poorly constructed roof. And yet they did not merely survive. They thrived. They built communities, raised families, created art, practiced faith, and developed traditions that have endured for 1,000 years. Their resilience was not passive. It was active, creative, and endlessly resourceful. When timber became scarce, they learned to build with stone. When open hearths filled their homes with smoke, they invented the chimney. When single-room living became untenable, they added rooms. When the Black Death devastated their communities, they rebuilt, bigger, better, and stronger than before. Every improvement in medieval domestic architecture was a response to a problem, a challenge, or an aspiration. And every improvement represented a small but significant step toward the homes we live in today. Walking through the surviving medieval buildings of England, the timber-framed houses of Lavenham, the stone manor houses of the Cotswolds, the great halls of castles like Stokesay and Penshurst, one is struck by the sheer skill and ingenuity that went into their construction. These were not the work of untrained amateurs throwing together rough shelters. They were the work of skilled craftsmen, carpenters, masons, thatchers, plasterers, who understood their materials intimately and who took genuine pride in their work. The precision of a medieval timber joint, the elegance of a stone arch, the complex geometry of a hammer-beam roof. These are achievements that command respect and admiration even today, nearly a millennium after they were created. The medieval carpenters, in particular, deserve special recognition. Theirs was an art form that has been largely lost in the modern world, where timber construction has been replaced by steel and concrete. A medieval master carpenter could look at a standing oak tree and visualize the finished building within it. He could calculate loads and stresses without the benefit of engineering formulas. He could cut and fit joints of extraordinary complexity using nothing more than hand tools, axes, adzes, chisels, and saws. The great timber roofs of medieval England, Westminster Hall, the barn at Great Coxwell, the roof of the Merchant Adventurers Hall in York, are among the most remarkable achievements of pre-industrial engineering, and they stand today as testaments to the genius of the people who built them. The story of medieval English homes is, ultimately, a story about what it means to be human. It is about the universal need for shelter, warmth, and safety. It is about the desire for beauty and comfort, even in the most challenging circumstances. It is about the bonds of family and community that are forged and maintained within the walls of a shared home. And it is about the relentless human drive to improve, to innovate, and to build a better life for the next generation. 1,000 years ago, the people of England woke up each morning in homes that we would scarcely recognize today. They shivered in the cold, squinted in the dark, and coughed in the smoke. They shared their space with their animals, their neighbors, and their extended families. They ate their bread and pottage, brewed their ale, mended their clothes, and tended their fires. And then they went out into the world and built a civilization. Their homes may be gone, rotted, burned, collapsed, or buried beneath centuries of later construction. But the spirit that animated those homes, the spirit of resilience, ingenuity, and community, lives on. It lives in the buildings that succeeded them. It lives in the architectural traditions that descended from them. And it lives in us, the inheritors of 1,000 years of English domestic history. How medieval homes looked in England 1,000 years ago. Now you know. And knowing, perhaps you will look at your own home, with its central heating, its electric lights, its running water, its private rooms, with a new sense of appreciation. Not just for the comforts you enjoy, but for the generations of builders, craftsmen, and ordinary people whose labor, ingenuity, and determination made those comforts possible. Because every home tells a story. And the story of the medieval English home is one of the greatest stories ever told. If you've watched this far, it's because you liked this case. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can get to know you and see who truly enjoys the stories on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and leave a like, which really strengthens our work. And if you know someone who loves history, share this video. Good knowledge is knowledge that's shared. See you in the next episode.